Alaska lay shrouded in an endless, impenetrable darkness. This was one of the world's strangest places, where sunlight abandoned the land for more than 2 months each year. The darkness stretched on with bone-chilling cold, while piercing winds howled across the small houses, like nature's silent warning. The stillness of the air was only broken by the faint whistling of the wind sneaking through cracks in the houses, gradually covering the walls with layers of frost. At the start of winter, everything in town appeared calm, with a kind of strange peace, as if the night had embraced the entire town. The people were accustomed to the prolonged darkness, living quietly in rhythm with the slowed pace of life here. The streets were blanketed in white snow, with faint yellow streetlights cutting through the night, illuminating scattered snowflakes swirling in the wind. On rare nights, the northern lights danced in shimmering waves across the sky, reflecting on the snowy ground below, adding a rare sense of warmth and mystery. But this peace was only on the surface, a fragile shell concealing an underlying anxiety. The people had lived so long in darkness that they began to feel as though they were trapped inside an inescapable box. The chill and darkness weighed on their spirits. The few twinkling lights in the houses along the streets looked like torches trying to fend off the endless night. People knew the darkness could be their ally, yet it could also be a lurking enemy, waiting to swallow everything. The town's police chief, a middle-aged, seasoned man, had worked here for over 15 years, familiar with every house, every street. He had witnessed these long, unending nights each year. Yet this year, he felt something different. It was an indescribable feeling, a vague worry creeping into his mind every time he stood on his porch, quietly observing the scattered lights in the windows. The darkness seemed deeper, colder, and more oppressive than before. The chief tried to reassure himself that this was simply a harsher winter than usual, but a faint instinct warned him otherwise. The night stretched on for weeks, and the town's activities shrank with it. People stayed indoors, visiting the store only when necessary, rarely meeting and gathering by their fireplaces in the warmth of their homes. Sam Walsh, the owner of the only grocery store in town, was among the few who opened early each morning and enjoyed chatting with anyone who stopped by. An elder who had lived here since childhood, Sam had witnessed countless winters come and go. He would tell everyone that he loved the winter in Barrow best because when the night stretched on, he felt like he was living in a separate world, quiet and isolated from the rest of the world. But even Sam, resilient and brave, sensed that something was different this winter. Sometimes standing in front of his store and gazing into the darkened street, he felt like something was moving out there in the night, something invisible and as cold as winter itself. On rare nights when the northern lights appeared, everyone temporarily forgot the darkness and chill to admire the shimmering colors across the sky. They felt as though they were revived, a spark of hope igniting amidst the unending night. But when the aurora faded, darkness once again swallowed everything, leaving only emptiness and eerie silence. The elders, like Sam, whispered that the aurora was a sign, a forewarning of something to come, something he couldn't explain. The police chief often wandered through town on such nights, passing through each street, gazing at the darkened homes. He remembered his early years on the job when the darkness was just a familiar part of life here, not the source of worry and unrest it was now. But this year, his steps felt heavier. Sometimes he would stop mid-street just to listen to the wind's eerie whispers among the trees, as if searching for a sound in the darkness. Carl and Donna, his two colleagues, noticed the change in the chief's demeanor. They didn't mention it, but there was an unspoken understanding in their eyes, as if they too sensed something strange lurking in the night. Barrow fell into a state of suspended unease, where people lived in a repetitive cycle of darkness and cold, shadowed by an invisible fear. Stories of darkness and strange happenings began to spread, old tales that the elders told their children every winter. People whispered of ghosts in the night, souls trapped between life and death, wandering across the snowfields of the Arctic. The children exchanged whispered tales of the hunter who disappeared into the darkness years ago, rumored to have been taken by the Arctic Terror, never to return. Each night, as snow piled deeper and deeper, snowmobiles on the streets became fewer, leaving a silence so deep it was unnerving. In the darkness, people sometimes heard strange noises from afar, footsteps crunching on snow, the faint sigh of someone in the distance, or the rustle of an unnamed creature moving across the snow. The faint noises, though small, were enough to send shivers through the townspeople. The police chief noticed an increase in calls to the station, but most were vague complaints, lacking clear cause. People reported hearing strange sounds outside their homes. Some felt watched every time they ventured out. A few families even started locking their doors early, keeping their children indoors and keeping their curtains drawn all day. The chief didn't know what to do since there was no solid evidence of anything unusual, but he couldn't dismiss the townspeople's worries. As the night patrols grew longer and quieter, the chief and his colleagues did their best to reassure residents, though they couldn't hide their own apprehensions. Even when they met at the station in the early hours, they often shared only silent glances, a mutual acknowledgement that something was slipping beyond their control. Each time the chief left home in the evening to patrol, he couldn't help but wonder if something was watching his every step. He tried to stay calm, but deep down, an invisible fear gnawed at him. This year, the darkness was no longer his familiar friend. It had become a strange, bottomless abyss, ready to consume anyone who dared enter it. The nights continued to drag on, and Barrow sank deeper into an atmosphere of deathly silence. Amid the Arctic winter's stillness, the chief and his colleagues realized that this town was no longer what they once knew. The darkness now seemed like an invisible curtain, hiding things no one dared to imagine. The chief wondered how long this would last, whether they would find an answer or if they would remain trapped in their own darkness forever. These thoughts, no matter how much he tried to push them away, kept resurfacing each time he walked through the night. He knew he couldn't ignore this strange change and wondered if this was only the beginning of something more horrifying. And as if in warning, the wind grew stronger, colder with each night, carrying the brutal chill from distant, desolate lands, a whisper from another world. It was a bitterly cold and quiet evening, with darkness blanketing Barrow as the town had come to a standstill. The police chief sat in his small office, surrounded by old files, the dim glow from his desk lamp creating a small pool of light in the otherwise dark room. Like the townspeople, he had grown accustomed to the darkness, but tonight, he felt as if something invisible was watching him, slipping silently through the walls and doors, like a ghost slithering through the night. The ringing of the phone shattered the silence, making him jump. The chief reached for the phone, hearing the shaky voice of Hannah Damon, who lived on the edge of town near the frozen coast. She sounded faint, her voice trembling with fear. "Hello, Chief. I'm sorry to call you at this hour, but something's happened to Charlie. My husband, he hasn't come home." He could hear the terror in Hannah's voice. The calm he usually felt was replaced by a gnawing worry as he realized this call was more than just a worried wife's concern. His instincts as a veteran officer told him that this wasn't a typical situation. He tried to keep his voice steady as he asked, "Stay calm, Hannah. Can you tell me where Charlie went and why you think something's wrong?" Hannah's voice choked up as she responded, "He went to work at the maintenance facility north of town. Normally, if there's a snowstorm or bad weather, he'd stay there overnight, but tonight it's calm. He should have been back hours ago, but I haven't heard anything from him." The chief hung up the phone and took a deep breath. A vague sense of dread welled up in him as he realized that this wasn't just Hannah's usual worry. He knew Charlie was a cautious man, and his lack of contact was out of character. He quickly called Carl, his loyal colleague, and the two of them headed over to Hannah's house. Driving through the snow-covered road leading to the outskirts, the chief couldn't shake the weight pressing on his heart. The headlights carved through the endless white, leaving flickering streaks of light in the darkness. He felt as though every tree and every patch of snow hid something, as if the darkness had come alive, watching and waiting to strike. When they reached Hannah's house, she was standing outside, wrapped tightly in a heavy coat, her breath turning to fog in the frigid air. The chief could see the fear in her eyes. The light from her window illuminated her face, revealing dark circles and a pale complexion, signs of sleepless nights filled with worry. "Chief, I know something's wrong," she said, her voice soft yet filled with urgency. Charlie always calls if anything happens. He never stays silent like this. I just know something terrible has happened." The chief tried to reassure her, though he himself was filled with doubt. He turned to Carl and both decided to head to the maintenance facility where Charlie worked. Before leaving, he told Hannah to go inside and lock her doors. He promised to return as soon as he had news. She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. The patrol car sped through the night, tires crunching on the snow-covered road, the sound strange in the otherwise silent surroundings. As they neared the facility, they spotted a truck parked by the roadside, headlights still on but empty inside. The chief immediately recognized it as Charlie's truck. Both men stepped out, their footsteps sinking into the snow, creating dull, muffled sounds that broke the dead silence. The area was completely still, save for the light whistling of the wind, cold enough to freeze skin on contact. Carl turned on his flashlight, pointing it toward the truck. The door was slightly open, the interior cold and empty. But as the flashlight swept over the front seat, both the chief and Carl felt a chill run down their spines. Inside the truck was a smear of blood, fresh but frozen in the bitter cold. On the white snow outside, small drops of blood formed a trail leading towards the coast. The chief crouched, gently touching the frozen blood stain. His heart pounded, his throat tightening as he tried to imagine what could have happened. He couldn't fathom what would make Charlie abandon his truck like this, only to be dragged away into the night. His mind raced with unease and fear, but he looked toward the direction of the blood trail. "We have to follow it," he whispered to Carl, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Carl nodded silently, his own eyes reflecting his own tension. The two men followed the blood trail, their steps light, as if fearing their footsteps would awaken something dreadful hiding in the dark. The flashlights in their hands illuminated each frozen droplet of blood on the snow, guiding them closer and closer to the coastline. The air grew colder and wetter, tinged with the salty smell of the sea and the wind. Around them, there was only a vast expanse of darkness, an unnatural silence, as if the land itself was holding its breath, watching their every step. Finally, the blood trail led them to a small clearing near the coast. Here, the snow was disturbed, signs of a violent struggle. When the flashlight shone on it, they saw strange marks on the ice, deep claw marks, as if something with sharp claws had raked across the frozen surface. The ice was cracked and scratched in many places, but there was no sign indicating where Charlie could have gone. Carl knelt down, running his gloved hand over the deep gouges in the ice. "Chief, what could have done this?" The chief didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the long, deep marks, as if he was searching for a logical explanation but finding none. His mind flashed to images of polar bears, powerful creatures they occasionally encountered in the area. But these marks looked different, deeper, more deliberate, as though whatever made them had done so with a specific intent. "It could be a bear," he replied quietly, though uncertainty colored his voice. "But it doesn't quite look like it. What kind of bear would do something like this?" Carl looked at him, his eyes filled with confusion. Both men stood in silence for a moment, their flashlights sweeping over the area. Suddenly, both had the feeling that something was watching them. A pair of unseen eyes locked on their every move from the darkness. They paused for a moment, straining their ears for any sound around them. But apart from the wind and the faint lapping of waves against the ice, there was nothing. Both men decided to return to Hannah to give her an update, though they were weighed down with a grim realization that Charlie's disappearance was no simple incident. On the way back, the chief couldn't stop thinking about what they had seen. The scene replayed vividly in his mind, the frozen blood on the snow, the strange, deep claw marks in the ice. He felt as if he had come face to face with something horrifying, but it was only the tip of the iceberg. A strange instinct told him this was just the beginning, and that the coming days might hold even darker horrors. As they reached the car, neither the chief nor Carl spoke a word, but both understood that something terrifying and unexplainable was happening in Barrow. They couldn't predict what lay ahead, only that this endless night might harbor more mysteries and horrors. In the days following Charlie's disappearance, an invisible fear tore through the atmosphere of Barrow, Alaska. A silent, lingering anxiety took hold of every home and street. After the recent disappearances, people no longer saw these as isolated incidents, but instead as a string of mysterious, terrifying, and inexplicable events. Their initial concern gradually escalated into full-blown dread, leaving an inescapable sense of foreboding. At first, the townspeople tried to maintain calm, clinging to their daily routines as a way of reassuring themselves. But as each day passed, the worry in their eyes deepened. The elders whispered to one another, sharing old tales of ghosts and wandering spirits trapped in the endless Arctic night. They recalled stories of disappearances from decades past, and everyone began to feel that these tales were no longer legends, but were becoming an eerie reality. In the town center, houses shut their doors early. Heavy, dark curtains covered windows, hiding the lights inside. Occasionally, the chief would notice people standing behind their windows, quietly gazing out as if expecting something dreadful to appear. Even the men who had once shown courage now huddled indoors, avoided going out at night, and often carried weapons when they did venture out. Grace, who ran the town's only coffee shop, began closing early, something she'd never done before. Usually tough and resilient, she was no longer able to hide her fear. She'd lock up early, spending most of her time in her kitchen, the only light coming from a small oil lamp. She would sit there for hours, clutching the wooden cross around her neck and whispering prayers, hoping that the strange events would soon end. The younger people, who had always dismissed ghost stories and legends, couldn't ignore the events unfolding around them. A few of them grew paranoid, like Jack, the husband of Linda, who had disappeared while walking her dog. Jack, once a diligent and cheerful worker, now looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted look. He began to suspect everyone around him, believing they knew something they were hiding. Jack wandered through town by day, questioning anyone he encountered about what they might have seen or heard, but people avoided him, only deepening his obsession. Others felt a mixture of skepticism and anger. They couldn't accept that the disappearances remained unexplained, and they began to suspect that the chief and his team were withholding something. They whispered that the chief was hiding the truth, that he knew what was happening, but wasn't saying. These quiet accusations sparked a wave of distrust, adding to the chief's burden. He understood there was little he could do to ease the fear of the townspeople when he, too, was haunted by the darkness and the strange signs he had encountered. Donna, his strong and determined colleague, was also unable to hide her fear. Each night during patrol with the chief, she felt as if invisible eyes were watching her every step in the darkness. She tried to stay calm, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Carl, the chief's longtime friend, was usually quiet, but the tension within him was obvious. Every night during patrol, he felt as if something was hiding in the shadows, watching his every move. He struggled to maintain his composure, but couldn't ignore the nagging fear that something terrible was coming for them. As time passed, the disappearances didn't stop. A young woman named Linda, who lived near the southern edge of town, also disappeared one evening while walking her dog. Her husband, Jack, searched throughout the night, but there was no sign of her. Only her dog's collar lay in the snow, along with a faint blood trail leading into the forest. By now, the town was gripped by fear. The chief did his best to maintain order, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to calm the growing fear. He called a town meeting at the police station, inviting all residents to attend. The meeting room was packed, everyone sitting quietly, their eyes fixed on him, hoping he would have an answer to the unfolding mystery. The chief stood before them, his gaze sweeping over the room, and spoke slowly, his voice steady yet tense. I know everyone's worried. The disappearances of Charlie, Jim, and Linda are unprecedented, and we're doing everything we can to investigate and find them. But I urge you all to stay calm and stay indoors at night. We don't know exactly what's happening, but I believe we can get through this together. From the back of the room, an elderly man rose to his feet. It was Martin, one of the oldest residents in town, a man who had lived here his entire life. He looked at the chief, his dim eyes filled with fear. "Chief," he said, his voice hoarse, "do you think it's possible that something has returned? Something our ancestors warned us about?" The entire room fell silent as everyone turned to look at Martin. In that moment, the chief realized it wasn't just he and his colleagues haunted by these disappearances. The townspeople, who had spent their lives in the cold and dark of the Arctic, harbored a deep fear of something unexplainable. Martin continued, his voice trembling. I remember my father telling me that many years ago there were similar disappearances. People said there was something in the darkness, a demon spirit, a creature that didn't belong to our world. It hunted in the night and never stopped. A few women held their breath while others exchanged fearful glances. These legendary stories, once mere folklore, were now disturbingly real. The chief tried to stay calm. He knew that if fear spread unchecked, the town would lose its peace. He walked over to Martin, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and spoke softly. Martin, I understand these stories, but we need to keep clear minds. I promise we're doing everything we can to find out what's happening and to keep everyone safe. But even as he spoke, the chief couldn't deny the growing worry within him. The ancient stories of creatures lurking in the dark seemed to be coming back to haunt him, creeping into his mind as he struggled to find a rational explanation for the disappearances. As the meeting ended, people left the station in silence. No one spoke, but in each person's eyes, the chief saw an unspoken fear. The night descended upon Barrow once more, and for the first time in years, the chief felt that this town was no longer the peaceful place it once was. It had become an unfamiliar land, where darkness ruled. The chief, Carl, and Donna began splitting patrol duties each night, making rounds through the town. Each time they passed a house, they would stop to check, reminding people to lock their doors and stay inside. Yet, even as they did so, they knew this was a temporary measure and could not guarantee complete safety. Each time he patrolled at night, the chief felt something following him, hiding in the darkness. He would see faint shadows moving in the distance, but as he approached, they disappeared. Occasionally, he heard a faint sound in the air, like someone's footsteps, but when he turned, only a cold, empty void stared back. Barrow had transformed into a desolate, eerie, and frightening place, and he knew this sense of unease would not easily fade. The string of disappearances, the strange noises at night, and the fearful gazes of the townspeople all pointed to something sinister lurking nearby. And though he didn't want to admit it, he knew they might be facing an unknown enemy, a shadow from the very heart of the Arctic cold, a force no one could understand or fight. Day by day, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier over Barrow, Alaska. Anxiety weighed on everyone like a thick layer of frost, pressing down on every home, every street in the small town. After the string of disappearances, people no longer viewed them as simple accidents, but saw them as part of a mysterious and terrifying sequence. Their initial concerns intensified, eventually escalating into full-blown panic, mistrust, and an inescapable fear. At first, people tried to stay calm, clinging to their routines for comfort. But as the days passed, worry filled each gaze. The elders whispered of old legends, stories of ghosts and spirits wandering the endless Arctic night. They recounted tales of disappearances from decades past, and everyone began to feel as though these stories were not merely legends, but were becoming reality. In the center of town, houses closed their doors early. Heavy, dark curtains were drawn, concealing the lights within. Occasionally, the chief saw people standing behind their windows, quietly watching as if waiting for something terrible to come. Men who had once been brave now huddled indoors, avoiding going out at night, often carrying weapons whenever they ventured out. Grace, the cafe owner, started closing earlier than ever, something she had never done before. She had always been tough and resilient, accustomed to the Arctic's long nights, but now she couldn't hide her fear. She closed her doors early and spent most of her time sitting in her small kitchen, the only light coming from a tiny oil lamp. She would sit there for hours, clutching her wooden cross and whispering prayers, hoping that these strange occurrences would pass. The younger people, who had always dismissed ghost stories and legends, couldn't ignore what was happening around them. Some grew paranoid, like Jack, Linda's husband, who had disappeared while walking her dog. Jack, once a cheerful, hardworking man, now looked hollowed out, his eyes shadowed, his gaze haunted. He began to suspect everyone around him, believing they knew something they weren't telling him. Jack wandered around town during the day, questioning anyone about what they had seen or heard. But people avoided him, only deepening his obsession. Others, however, were filled with skepticism and anger. They couldn't accept that the disappearances remained unexplained and began to suspect the chief and his team. They whispered that the chief was hiding something, that he knew what was happening but wouldn't tell. These quiet accusations sparked a wave of distrust, adding to the chief's burden. He understood that there was little he could do to calm everyone's fear when he, too, was haunted by darkness and the strange signs he had seen. Donna, his strong and resilient colleague, could no longer hide her fear. Every night during patrol, she felt invisible eyes following her, tracking her every step. She tried to stay calm, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. Carl, usually a man of few words, also felt the rising tension. Every night, while patrolling, he sensed something hiding in the darkness, watching his every move. He struggled to keep his composure, but couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the town was on the brink of disaster. Time passed, but the disappearances didn't stop. A young woman named Linda, living near the town's southern edge, also went missing one evening while walking her dog. Her husband, Jack, searched the entire night but found no trace of her. Only her dog's collar lay in the snow, with a faint trail of blood leading deep into the forest. By now, fear had completely gripped the town. The chief tried to maintain order, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to calm the growing fear. He called a town meeting at the police station, inviting everyone to attend. The room was packed, everyone sitting in silence, their eyes fixed on him, hoping he would have an answer to the unfolding mystery. He stood before them, looking around the room before speaking slowly, his voice steady but tense. "I know everyone's worried. The disappearances of Charlie, Jim, and Linda are unprecedented, and we're doing everything we can to investigate and find them. However, I urge you to stay calm and stay indoors at night. We don't know exactly what's happening, but I believe we can get through this together." From the back of the room, an elderly man rose. It was Martin, one of the town's oldest residents, a man who had lived his entire life in Barrow. He looked at the chief, his dim eyes filled with terror. "Chief," he said, his voice shaking, "do you think it's possible that something has returned, something our ancestors warned us about?" The room fell silent, everyone turning to look at Martin. In that moment, the chief realized that it wasn't just he and his colleagues haunted by the disappearances. The townspeople, those who had spent their entire lives in the cold and dark of the Arctic, held a deep fear of something unexplainable. Martin continued, his voice trembling. "I remember my father telling me that many years ago, there were similar disappearances. People said there was something in the darkness, a demon spirit, a creature that didn't belong to our world. It hunted in the night and never stopped." Some women held their breath, while others exchanged fearful glances. These legendary stories, once mere folklore, had become disturbingly real. The chief tried to stay calm. He knew that if fear spread unchecked, the town would lose its peace. He walked over to Martin, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and spoke softly. "Martin, I understand these stories, but we need to keep clear minds. I promise we're doing everything we can to find out what's happening and to keep everyone safe." But even as he spoke, the chief couldn't deny the growing worry within him. The ancient stories of creatures lurking in the dark seemed to be coming back to haunt him, creeping into his mind as he struggled to find a rational explanation for the disappearances. When the meeting ended, people left the station in silence. No one spoke, but in each person's eyes, the chief saw an unspoken fear. The night descended upon Barrow once more, and for the first time in years, the chief felt that this town was no longer the peaceful place it once was. It had become an unfamiliar land where darkness ruled. The chief, Carl, and Donna began splitting patrol duties each night, making rounds through the town. Each time they passed a house, they would stop to check, reminding people to lock their doors and stay inside. Yet, even as they did so, they knew this was a temporary measure and could not guarantee complete safety. Each time he patrolled at night, the chief felt something following him, hiding in the darkness. He would see faint shadows moving in the distance, but as he approached, they disappeared. Occasionally, he heard a faint sound in the air, like someone's footsteps, but when he turned, only a cold, empty void stared back. Barrow had transformed into a desolate, eerie, and frightening place, and he knew this sense of unease would not easily fade. The string of disappearances, the strange noises at night, and the fearful gazes of the townspeople all pointed to something sinister lurking nearby. And though he didn't want to admit it, he knew they might be facing an unknown enemy, a shadow from the very heart of the Arctic cold, a force no one could understand or fight. The growing fear of Barrow hung heavy, and with each new disappearance, the unease deepened. The chief knew that if this continued, the town would fall into complete panic. However, he also understood that to stop this darkness, he would have to risk venturing deeper and uncover the truth while he still had the chance. That evening, after a long and exhausting day, the chief, Carl, and Donna decided to follow the traces left near Sam Walsh's house, hoping to find a clue that might shed light on the situation. The darkness blanketed the town like a thick shroud, and the temperature dropped so low their breaths turned to frost immediately. Their flashlights cast narrow beams ahead, but it only made them feel more surrounded by the shadows. The trail began at Sam's shattered house and stretched into the forest outside town. It was a snow-covered path lined with towering pine trees, whose dark branches loomed over them like twisted shadows. Fresh snow covered the path, showing no sign that anyone had passed through. But as they ventured deeper, they found patches of disturbed snow, as if something heavy had been dragged through. Donna, usually courageous and composed, couldn't shake her fear as they moved through each shadowed part of the forest. She thought about the stories Martin had shared during the meeting, about the creature in the darkness, which he claimed had returned to haunt the town. Although she had always been skeptical, Donna couldn't ignore the feeling that it was all too real. The chief walked ahead, his steps slow but determined, even as his mind was flooded with troubling thoughts. He knew he was leading his two colleagues into danger, but he also knew they had no other choice. They had to find out what was happening and confront whatever was lurking in the dark. Carl, usually silent, walked behind the chief, clutching his gun tightly. His eyes reflected both tension and exhaustion. With each step into the forest, he felt an eerie silence closing in, as if the entire forest had stopped breathing, observing their every move. He couldn't shake the thought that they might never return. Deep in the forest, they found a clearing among the trees. The snow here had been disturbed, and in the middle of the clearing lay a large patch of blood, frozen solid, as if someone or something had been attacked here. Footprints were imprinted in the snow, leading deeper into the forest. The chief and his team stopped, their flashlights illuminating the terrifying scene, feeling the chill of death creeping around them. "Chief," Carl whispered, his voice trembling. "This might be where Sam met his end." The chief only nodded, understanding the implication. Whatever was out there was not just killing to protect its territory or out of hunger. It was hunting people, seeming to enjoy the chase and the kill. Donna, trying to keep her composure, looked around. "Maybe we should turn back, Chief. This might be a trap we won't be able to escape from." The chief thought for a moment before nodding. He knew Donna was right. Going further would only increase the danger. But as he was about to signal them to turn back, a strange sound echoed from deep in the forest, a low, growling noise, distant but clear enough for them to hear. It was a sound both wild and mournful, broken and incomprehensible. All three stood still, their hearts pounding. They aimed their flashlights in the direction of the sound but saw only thick darkness and the silhouettes of trees. The chief motioned for Donna and Carl to ready their weapons. He didn't know what made the sound, but he knew it wasn't a creature they had ever encountered. The sound grew louder, closer, and this time the chief was sure it was heading toward them. No one dared move. They stood there, hearts racing, eyes fixed on the darkness. Carl gripped his gun tightly, his hand trembling but his gaze resolute. Donna, holding her gun, muttered a quiet prayer, hoping she would survive this forest. Suddenly, a shadowy figure flashed through their dim lights. It was a large shape, moving quickly and silently among the trees, almost without making a sound. All three immediately pointed their flashlights toward it, but the shadow disappeared instantly, as if it had never been there. Yet the chief was sure he had seen it. A massive creature, its fur white as snow, but its eyes, he was certain, were black, hollow, and as cold as death itself. "Run," the chief ordered, and the three bolted in the opposite direction, fleeing back toward the town. Their footsteps echoed through the forest, mingling with their rapid breaths and pounding hearts. They ran as fast as they could, feeling as if the creature was right behind them, playing a game of chase. Occasionally, they heard strange noises behind them. The faint growl, the snap of a branch, and the sound of something stepping heavily on the snow, but none of them dared to look back. Donna ran ahead, breathing heavily, focused only on the thought of escape. Beside her, Carl struggled to keep pace despite his fatigue. The chief, bringing up the rear, tried to keep his distance from the creature, but he felt it closing in, like an invisible shadow gliding through the trees, following their every step. At last, they neared the forest's edge, where the faint lights of the town came into view. The three of them breathed a sigh of relief, knowing they were close to safety. But just as they crossed the tree line, the chief turned around and saw it. Standing quietly in the darkness, at the edge of the forest, was the massive creature with fur white as snow, its hollow black eyes staring directly at him. In that moment, he felt an intense, malicious intent radiating from it. This wasn't just a bear. This was a nightmare brought to life, and it had chosen this town as its target. He motioned for Carl and Donna to keep moving, but he couldn't take his eyes off the creature. It stood motionless for a few seconds longer, then slowly backed into the shadows, vanishing into the forest's depths. All three of them stood in silence for a moment, breathing heavily, the terror still hanging in the air around them. They couldn't explain what they had just seen, but they knew that safety was no longer a guarantee. The town was no longer peaceful, and this darkness wasn't merely the Arctic winter. It was something else, an evil force hunting everyone, and this time, it wouldn't stop. After the terrifying night in the forest, the chief, Carl, and Donna returned to town, exhausted and weighed down by fear. They knew that the creature wasn't just an ordinary animal. It was something beyond human understanding, a demon born from the Arctic darkness. The chief couldn't sleep, his mind filled with the image of the creature's cold, empty eyes, its gaze as heartless as death. The townspeople began to notice the tension in their protectors. The dark winter now gripped Barrow with a force that left no one feeling safe. Rumors of a giant creature spread through the town. People whispered that the beast emerged from the deep woods, that it bore the power of death itself, and that every time it appeared, a life would be taken, leaving only bloodstains on the snow. The chief knew they couldn't avoid the creature forever. He sensed it was nearby, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to attack. He called Carl and Donna into his office, where they gathered to discuss a plan. Although none of them said it out loud, all three understood that this might be the last time they saw each other. This confrontation was no longer just a mission to complete. It was a fight for survival. "We have to do something," the chief said, his voice low but determined. "I don't know what it is, but if we don't stop it, this town will be destroyed." Carl sat silently for a moment before speaking. "We could use weapons, but I don't think bullets alone will stop it. We need a different plan, something stronger." Donna nodded, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "Maybe, if we trap it in a confined space and use fire or explosives to hurt it, we might have a chance." Finally, they agreed that the only way was to lure the creature to a place where they could set a trap. After a while of planning, they decided on the abandoned school on the town's outskirts, a place few people ever visited. The school's narrow hallways and small rooms would be ideal for setting up barriers and traps. Carl suggested they use flammable substances and old gas canisters to create a fire trap. The plan was risky and unrefined, but it was their only hope. That night, under a sky thick with clouds and an unbearably low temperature, the three of them prepared for the confrontation. They armed themselves with everything they had: shotguns, high-powered flashlights, and gas canisters they had found in the school's storage. No one said a word, but each gaze was filled with both fear and resolve. The abandoned school, already eerie and desolate, felt even more terrifying in the dim light. Empty hallways stretched out before them, covered in layers of dust, with doors creaking ominously in the wind. It was a place filled with darkness and the smell of neglect. The chief, Carl, and Donna slowly made their way inside, flashlights casting strange elongated shadows on the walls. Every footstep echoed, adding to the oppressive silence. They split up to place the gas canisters at strategic points throughout the school. The chief, walking alone through the darkened hallways, felt his breath grow heavier. He knew the creature was near, as though it sensed their plan. He stopped midway down a hallway, gripping his gun tightly, straining his ears for the faintest sound. And then, in the dead stillness, he heard it, a deep, menacing growl echoing from the end of the hall like a warning. The chief turned, his flashlight pointing directly into the darkness, and in that weak beam of light, he saw its black, hollow eyes. It was a massive creature, its white fur blending into the shadows. "Come on," the chief muttered, trying to suppress his fear. He aimed the flashlight, creating a path of light to lead the creature toward the trap. The creature drew closer, moving slowly but deliberately. Each step made the wooden floor creak, and the air around them grew thick, flowless, as though every breath it took drained the life from the room. It made no noise apart from the occasional low growl, but its presence made the chief feel as if he was facing death itself. He started to back away, step by step, leading the creature toward the large room where they had set up the gas canisters. Carl and Donna were waiting there, standing near the exit, ready to ignite the trap as soon as the creature was in position. The chief took a deep breath, a strange mixture of fear and hope rising in his chest. Finally, the creature entered the room, its massive form illuminated by Donna's flashlight, and Carl immediately activated the gas canisters. There was a loud explosion and flames erupted, engulfing the creature. The room was bathed in a red glow as fire consumed the beast. It thrashed and roared in pain, clawing at the walls, its massive body struggling to escape the flames. The chief, Carl, and Donna backed away, eyes fixed on the creature. They hoped the fire would be enough to kill it, but the beast wasn't easily defeated. After a few minutes of writhing in the flames, it suddenly stood, its entire body engulfed in fire, but its hollow black eyes still burned with a malicious fury. "This can't be," Carl whispered, his hand trembling. The creature charged toward them, heedless of the flames licking its body. Donna screamed, firing shot after shot, but nothing could stop it. The chief shouted for them to retreat, and the three of them bolted out of the school, trying to escape the creature's wrath. They ran outside, breaths shallow and gasping, as the creature, wounded but relentless, pursued them through the darkness. Just as they crossed the threshold, the chief had a desperate idea. He turned back, stepped back into the building, and triggered one last gas canister placed by the entrance. The explosion rang out into the night, the entire school shaking as fire erupted from the entrance. The creature let out a howl of pain and despair as it was completely engulfed in flames. The chief, Donna, and Carl were thrown to the ground, landing on the cold, icy ground, staring up at the burning building. As the flames began to die down, they saw the creature lying motionless in the ruins. None of them dared approach, but they knew it was finally over. The chief looked up at the sky, where faint ribbons of aurora began to shimmer, casting a dim light across the Arctic night. It was a small sign, but it brought a sense of hope after the nightmare. The three of them, exhausted yet alive, sat in silence, their gazes locked on the distant horizon. They had faced the darkness and won, at least for now. Barrow was once again at peace, but in their hearts, they knew the darkness would return, lurking, waiting for its next chance. After the horrifying confrontation at the abandoned school, Barrow sank into a heavy silence. The flames had destroyed the mysterious creature, but they had left wounds that wouldn't easily heal in the hearts of the survivors. The chief, Carl, and Donna sat together, exhausted and reflecting on their hard-won victory over the nightmare. But the sense of relief didn't last. The darkness of the Arctic winter remained thick and haunting, and none of them could be certain that the nightmare was truly over. As the faint light of the aurora gradually faded, the daylight was set to return, but everyone knew it wasn't a permanent salvation. The chief, haunted by the creature's gaze before it fell in flames, understood that the recent confrontation was just one battle. What had brought the creature to Barrow? Were there others hiding in the darkness beyond? All three sat in silence, their gazes vacant, bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The chief was the first to break the silence, his voice raspy and faint. "We need to do something to make sure this town never has to go through this again." Carl, leaning against the wall, sighed heavily. But what can we do, Chief? That thing doesn't belong to this world, and all we managed to do was stop it for a while. Donna, head down and still shaken, added, Maybe we should warn everyone, not just in this town, but in the surrounding areas too. If one creature appeared here, others could be out there. The chief nodded. The thought of this spreading beyond Barrow sent chills down his spine. He didn't want to cause panic, but he also knew they couldn't stay silent. He decided to write a detailed report of the events and send it to the Alaska state authorities, hoping they would implement stricter safety measures. When they returned to town, the terror spread across every house and street. People in Barrow heard about the battle and the creature's death, but what remained were whispers and rumors that no one dared to speak of openly. Although no one spoke out loud, everyone knew that Barrow's peace had been shattered and would never fully return. Mayor Reiner called an emergency meeting at the town hall the following morning. In the small, crowded room, people sat closely together, anxious, exhausted, and waiting for an explanation from the chief. Reiner began the meeting, trying to keep his voice calm but failing to hide his worry. As everyone knows, last night the chief and his colleagues faced an unimaginable danger, something beyond our world. That creature was destroyed, but I want us to discuss what we should do to protect the town in the future. The chief stood up, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He looked around the room, his gaze passing over each face, faces that were once familiar but now seemed distant, haunted by an unshakable fear. We did everything we could to protect this town, he said, his voice choked. But we can't be certain that this is the end. I don't know where that creature came from or why it was here, but I do know we need to stay vigilant. An elderly man stood up, his voice trembling with fear and anger. Chief, we trust you. But now, after everything that's happened, we don't know what we can do to protect ourselves. We can't live in fear forever. Others in the room murmured in agreement. The chief understood that this panic couldn't easily be dispelled, and that he needed to do something to reassure everyone. He decided to organize a night patrol team, recruiting volunteers from the town to maintain security and guard against any future threats. He also advised everyone to avoid going out at night and to prepare emergency communication plans. Carl and Donna, after resting for a few days, resumed night patrols with the volunteer team. Although both were worn out from the horrifying events, they couldn't abandon their town. Carl, still haunted by the creature's gaze before it felt his mission was unfinished. He stayed up every night, patrolling around houses and isolated areas, trying to spot any suspicious sign. Donna was no different. She often woke up in the middle of the night, feeling as though something was lurking outside her window. Even though she knew the creature had been destroyed, she couldn't shake her fear. Nightmares became her constant companions, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the creature's hollow, hate-filled eyes staring at her from the darkness. Despite the Arctic winter's prolonged darkness, Barrow gradually tried to return to normal life. People busied themselves repairing damaged homes, and children went back to school, but no one truly forgot the horrifying events. An invisible fear lingered in the air, and any strange sound at night made everyone jump. Meanwhile, the chief decided to investigate the strange events in Barrow's history, hoping to uncover clues about the creature's origin. He searched old records in the town library, where historical documents and folklore were stored. In an old book, he found a description of mysterious beings known to the native people as demons of the dark. Entities that only appeared in winter when the sun disappeared from the sky and darkness stretched endlessly. According to the indigenous legends, these creatures were not entirely part of the human world. They existed in a parallel realm, and only when the light was completely gone could they cross into the human world. The chief felt a chill down his spine as he read these lines, wondering if the creature they had encountered was indeed one of these demons of the dark mentioned in the legend. He decided to organize a meeting with the local native community, hoping to receive guidance or advice. At the meeting, he met an elderly Inuit man named Nanook, who had lived through many Arctic winters and knew the ancient legends well. Nanook sat quietly, his gaze thoughtful as the chief recounted the entire story, describing the creature. The demons of the dark are not something humans can face, Nanook said, his voice calm, yet filled with authority. They are entities that live between worlds, existing only to spread fear and haunt the living. When the sun disappears, they can see us, but we cannot see them unless they want us to. The chief listened silently, feeling as if he was sinking into a nightmare. He asked Nanook if there was any way to stop them or protect the town if they returned. Nanook looked at him, his eyes filled with sorrow, and shook his head. There is no way to completely destroy them, but if we can ensure that the light never goes out, they won't be able to approach. Light is the only thing they fear. After the conversation with Nanook, the chief returned to town, determined to protect Barrow at all costs. He devised a plan to ensure the town would always have light, even during the darkest nights of winter. He advised all residents to keep their lights on at night and coordinated with authorities to install additional street lights and backup generators everywhere. The town of Barrow adapted to life under constant illumination. People grew accustomed to keeping lights on throughout the night, and the sense of safety from the light gradually replaced the fear of darkness. But deep down, the chief, Carl, and Donna knew that the creature was not the only one, and that the Arctic darkness was always waiting to return. They continued their lives, continued to protect the town, but always stayed prepared. Barrow had survived a nightmare, but darkness would never completely surrender. It had merely retreated, waiting for another time when the lights would go out and fear would once again become a reality. As the chief gazed out over the distant horizon, he knew that the fight against the Arctic darkness would never truly end. When the sun began to rise over the horizon after months of darkness, Barrow was slowly bathed in a pale light. For the townspeople, it was the light of life. It had been a long time since they felt warm sunlight on their skin, and it felt like a miracle that had been long lost. People who had been living in fear, unable to venture out at night, now felt as though they were being reborn as sunlight filled every corner. Yet, despite the return of daylight, the darkness remained in their hearts. Everyone's gaze still held an unspoken fear, and whispers about the creature that had once terrorized them lingered in every corner. The chief, Carl, and Donna were hailed as heroes, but they didn't see themselves that way. All three knew this peace was temporary, and darkness could return with the next winter. After that terrifying night, the chief often walked alone through the streets, looking up at the open sky. The daylight seemed to make the town feel lighter and more peaceful, but deep in his heart, he felt an unshakable emptiness and unease. He knew the creature might have been just a small part of things humans couldn't explain, and the current light wouldn't last forever. He had set up plans to protect the town for when the darkness returned. Every major building in town was outfitted with additional lighting and backup generators. Streets, areas near the woods, and even the abandoned schoolyard where the creature had been fought were all lit and equipped with alarm systems. He did everything he could to make light the town's shield, a fragile shield, but one that brought a sense of safety. At town meetings, the chief would stand before the crowd, urging everyone to keep lights on in their homes at night and to never let the town be plunged into complete darkness. Even with the sun now up, he didn't want anyone to forget the lessons of the past winter. He also advised each household to keep a high-powered flashlight and prepare emergency power supplies for any blackout. Carl, who seemed outwardly strong, couldn't shake his inner turmoil. He spent sleepless nights sitting alone on his porch, his gaze fixed on the shadows, the light from his house casting a dim glow onto the snow, as if he hoped it could illuminate anything lurking out there. He had changed, no longer the cheerful, approachable man he once was. His eyes were always pensive, and his smile had faded. Friends and family understood he had endured something far beyond normal, but no one dared ask too many questions. They simply hoped time would heal Carl. Donna, on the other hand, found peace in her work and often helped residents check and maintain their lights. She had become cautious and watchful, never stepping outside at night without a flashlight and always carrying a weapon. Donna had lost the optimism and friendly smile she once had, replaced by an air of vigilance, sometimes even coldness. she knew the darkness had left a deep scar in her mind, and though she no longer saw the creature, it had left her with an indelible fear. The town's children, though young, understood that something was not quite right. They would gather in groups during the day, whispering stories they had overheard from adults. Some said they had heard growling from the woods at night. Others swore the creature's ghost still appeared when the darkness was thick enough. These stories, however fantastical, became a part of Barrow's collective psyche, adding a sense of mystery and unease. Gradually, as daylight grew stronger and the long winter began to fade, the chief sensed the town slowly regaining a semblance of peace. He hoped they would have more time to recover, to banish the fear, but he also knew winter would come again, and darkness would cover Barrow once more. As the days passed, the chief began to consider recording the entire story, not as a report, but as a legacy for future generations. He believed the next generation needed to know about the creature in the darkness and understand that this place had once faced an unimaginable threat. He wanted to leave a reminder, a legacy of the battle between humans and the darkness, so that those who came after wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. One late winter afternoon, he called Carl and Donna to his office. The three of them sat around the table in silence for a long time before the chief finally spoke, his voice low but resolute. "We need to leave something for this town, a journal, a warning. I want us to record this entire story, all that we went through, all that we saw, not for outsiders, but so that future generations will understand and be cautious." Carl nodded in agreement, while Donna listened intently. They all understood that their mission wasn't just to protect the town in the present, but also to prepare for the future. They began documenting every detail, every event, every fear and anxiety, every action they had taken to protect Barrow. Page by page, the journal filled, each sentence bearing witness to their fierce struggle and what they had faced. They wrote down their deepest thoughts, fear, pain, and courage. The journal became a living document, carrying the spirit of those who had fought in the darkness. When summer arrived, the journal was complete. The chief, Carl, and Donna decided to place it in a metal box and bury it beneath the ground near the police station, where they knew it would be safe and could be found when needed. It was a quiet act, but one full of meaning, a reminder that darkness would always exist and danger could appear at any moment. At last, when the sun filled all of Barrow and the Arctic summer was drenched in light, the chief, Carl, and Donna sat together, watching the sunrise. They knew this light was not just the end of a winter, but also the beginning of a new hope. Barrow may have survived this darkness, but they knew that the fight against the Arctic night was never truly over. In the early morning light, all three felt a sense of relief and resolve. They knew they had done all they could to protect the town, and now all that was left was to wait for the day when darkness would return. But this time, they would be more prepared than ever.